Live. Got good audio. Perfect. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Headwaters Science Center. Well, welcome to the Headwaters Science Center's Twitch stream, I suppose. Or YouTube or Facebook, whatever you might be watching on. My name is Ryan. I'm one of the educators here. And as is implied in the title of this stream, today we're going to be doing a React video. It's been a while since we've done one of these. But Tierzu, who, if you've been following us for a long time, put out a new video a couple weeks ago. And I haven't watched it yet, so I think we'll do that here today. So hopefully that's engaging for y'all. It's called Are Horns OP? And I gotta say, just like right off the bat, my initial instinct to answer that question is probably no. Horns don't feel like something that is OP. If you're not familiar with the term OP, stands for overpowered. It's a relatively common term, like I said, in like competitive video games, which is kind of Tierzu's whole gimmick. And when you describe something as OP, generally what you're saying is that it is like strong to the point that it is like the rest of the game has to be like built around it, basically. So describing something as OP generally means that it's like very integral to like what everyone else around you is doing. And I don't see Horns, or maybe he'll go into Antlers a little bit in this too, really being that. But even the stuff that like has horns, you know, and obviously it's today at least, most closely associated with like hoofed animals. It's, you know, your deer and your bovids and your antelopes and whatnot that have horns primarily. And when I think of something like a bison, for example, like, and I think about the thing that I'm like, what makes a bison good? If I wake up tomorrow and I'm a bison, what parts of that am I excited about? It's not having horns necessarily. It's like I live in a big group, and that's great. I'm very big, and that's great. Don't have to worry about that many predators. I have a pretty solidly like accessible diet. Like, I'm not struggling to find food generally because I'm just a big grazer. Got kind of a unique pelt that is handy for a lot of things, insulation being one of them, obviously kind of what it's mainly used for, but also like as a defensive thing, like having the thick fur is really handy as well. But like horns are not like high on that list if I'm thinking of this in terms of a bison. I'm trying to think of an animal where I'm like, yeah, you really need the horn, and the horn is like what makes you good. And I honestly like can't really think of one. And I can even think of it in terms of like a deer, or any of the deer family that have antlers that they grow and shed every year. Like, they're not supremely useful outside of like mating season. And so what they're using them for primarily is just like fighting against other males during mating season. And there's a reason they don't keep them all year round. It's because they're like not actually that handy to have around, and they're big and heavy and get in the way of stuff. But growing them every year has its knocks too. I mean, they're really weirdly like metabolically intensive to grow, just because they grow so fast. Like, growing that much bone that fast is expensive in a way that having regular horn isn't. But he might go into all this, and like I said, maybe Tierzu is gonna convince me during this that horns are actually very good. But like I said, I'm not holding my breath on it.
Players have a wide selection of equipment to choose from when speccing their character. Teeth, claws, stingers, spikes, each weapon has distinct advantages and disadvantages in combat. Some, like teeth, are better at dealing damage but offer less range and require the user take a significant risk committing to an attack attempt. Claws are a good middle ground, offering solid damage but allowing the user to keep their vitals at least a little bit further away from counterattack range. On the other end of the spectrum is what I'd like to discuss in today's video: horns and antlers. This video was sponsored by Audible. Excluding things like projectiles, skull-based weapons have by far the furthest reach in the game. This makes them excellent defensive weapons, as it gives players a large threat range that an approaching player needs to find a way to get through in order to connect with their own attack.
Yeah, and this is true, and again, a lot of this is very much tied to the fact that like a lot of stuff that has horns and antlers are big, and so you can hit hard, and like having something that facilitates that a little bit is like inherently good, I suppose. The other thing that it feels like it's way good against is things that attack solo. So things and predators that aren't hunting in groups. Because you can see like this is a Cape buffalo or a water buffalo or whatever that is up against a lion, seemingly a single lion, and it's able to be effective. I guarantee you at some point he's going to show us some footage here of like a pack of wolves on a bison, and we're going to see how it doesn't work that great once you get multiple predators in the mix, because it only really keeps you defended from one side, and it's arguably like really limiting in your movement in that one direction too, in a way that probably makes you more vulnerable from the back than just not having the horns would.
Against a player with powerful horns or large antlers, messing up your approach and getting counterattacked can spell disaster, since these attacks can deal devastating damage when they connect. However, actually connecting with a strike isn't always easy for players who spec into this trait. Since skull projections can be quite heavy and cumbersome, swinging them can be quite slow and risky in and of itself, because if the attack is dodged by an aggressive opponent, you might be left wide open to getting rushed down and taking a ton of damage. So today I'd like to delve deeper into the advantages and disadvantages that come with equipping skull weapons to your character, and discuss some examples of good and bad usage of this perk. The two main types of skull weapons are horns and antlers. Horns are permanent and usually equipable to both sexes, whereas antlers are grown and shed each year, and usually a perk exclusive to male characters. Players in the Servid faction have exclusive access to antlers, while horns can be equipped to a wide variety of character types and have the major advantage of being permanent. Large antlers are useful for resource competition against other players, and occasionally to deter predators, but really their primary function is tied to the reproduction questline. Part of the Servid questline is that in order to complete the mating quest, male characters need to become party leader, and in order to achieve the rank of party leader, a Servid must duel against other male Servid characters and defeat them. Antlers allow these players to duel in a way that tests their strength while still remaining mostly non-lethal, as these players don't actually want to team kill their own party members. As far as combat abilities go, antlers probably aren't the most optimal choice. They weigh the user down quite a bit, make it more difficult to move through dense forest.
And this is something that came up in one of the videos, maybe it was the Ice Age one, where I was talking about how you eventually got deer with this, because like with deer, like I said, it feels a lot more like it's a sexual selection thing than necessarily a like survivability thing. The increased antler size, like the antler size helps you fight against other deer, which gets you mates, and so having the bigger antlers, like I said, helps you reproduce more. It doesn't necessarily help you survive more. And we were talking about one of the big giant Ice Age deer where, you know, the antlers just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until it was like, oops, we can't even like carry these around anymore. Like we can't move, and we're just getting eaten by predators because of it. And it ended up being more of a detriment than what it was worth, and you see the antlers go down again, basically.
And the enormous amount of energy it takes to shed and regrow them on a regular basis makes them a handicap rather than a perk. They don't have many secondary uses either. They can be used to dig with, but there's no upside to using antlers to dig rather than your feet. In short, antlers are a flex, the kind players can really only get away with when they're already doing quite well and have resources to spare. And even then, antler users tend to ditch the trait as soon as the window to complete the mating questline closes for the year. Horns, on the other hand, can be used to great effect against a wider variety of opponents. Large horns can deal devastating piercing damage and can also be used to inflict knockback, destabilizing even the most aggressive players and creating an opening for a deadly strike to connect. However, they're really only useful in 1v1 combat, since a group of attackers can easily overwhelm a horn user from multiple directions at once, and
And this is exactly what I talked about before we started the video, or not before we started, like as we were getting into the video, is that a lot of the stuff that hunts these big hoofed animals are pack hunting animals, things like lions, things like wolves, things like that. And so that's a big part of the reason why, like, my immediate read on this was like, they're probably not that good as far as like avoiding predation goes. And this is something that again got talked about when we were talking about dinosaurs. Particularly when we were talking about Triceratops has this similar issue where it's got all this stuff on the front side of it that's very valuable as far as warding off one predator, but as soon as you get more than one, you're toast.
Prevent them from connecting a strike.
And in that sense, like if you're talking about something that is like OP, something that is overpowered in the modern meta, like pack hunting is really good. Having a lot of intelligence, being really smart is really good because it facilitates you being able to live close to humans, basically. Humans are OP. We're the singular thing in this world that is like quote unquote OP right now. And so everything else that is good exists relative to us, basically, is the way I think about it. And I don't see horns necessarily like being that in any meaningful capacity.
So it's important to balance your character with other traits like bulk or speed to help compensate for this weakness. Skull weapons were added to the game's equipment roster during the late Tetrapod expansion, possibly serving to facilitate party member recognition and later being co-opted for defensive purposes.
Yeah, and somebody recently, it's been a few months at this point, donated a bunch of taxidermied like African antelopes and sheep and things like that to us. And so we have, and several of them are now mounted up on the wall at the Science Center. You can come in and see them. But one of the things that's really interesting about them is the like relative diversity of the shapes of the horns that you see in those. Which really speaks to this idea of they're not necessarily built for defense per se, because if they're built for like defending against lions, like you're gonna see a certain confluence over time of like the shapes are gonna become the same basically because there's an optimal shape for protecting yourself against a lion attack probably. But you don't see that. You see all kinds of horns, different scales, different shapes, different like positionings, forward, up, side kind of stuff. And a lot of the speculation on that is because they're less useful in a defensive capacity than they are in a identifying capacity, like what he was just referring to here, where the horns are, you're not using the horns to fight lions, you're using the horns to say, oh yeah, that's another kudu, I can go mate with that potentially.
While data miners are unsure whether early horn users like the Triceratops build had horn attacks as an integral part of their combat movesets, players in the current meta employ a wide variety of strategies to get the most out of their equipment. Tank builds like the Rhinoceros tend to use horns primarily for the knockback effect in 1v1 matchups, though they're capable of inflicting lethal piercing damage as well. More agile builds like the Wildebeest and Cape Buffalo coordinate team defenses against predators that employ both horn and kick attacks, and have a high critical hit ratio due to the sharpness of their horns. Some animals with skull weapons favor other types.
But again, the thing that's good there isn't the horns. The thing that's good is the teamwork
of attacks, using their long legs as the primary line of defense against predators, and mostly use their skull mods to fight against others of the same build type. As powerful and impressive as horns are, their overall contribution to the viability of a character is less than you might expect, especially in terms of how vital they are to a player's game plan for dealing with predator attacks. Most horn users spend a ton of evolution points on their base speed stat to avoid confrontation with more powerful players in the first place, meaning that heavy skull equipment actually impedes this strategy rather than synergizing with it. Horn attacks tend to be employed as a last...
Going back to this, I saw this happen one time with a white-tailed deer, where it was jumping over a fence and got, just clipped it with the back foot and got its antlers tied up into it.
Actually impede
Saw it happen for real once. It's a real thing that happens. It not just happen to elk. It happens just to whitetails.
Use this strategy rather than synergizing with it. Horn attacks tend to be employed as a last resort with varying degrees of success, since their base accuracy is so low. Horns lose their value in combat if the player's head is immobilized. So to use this perk effectively, the build should have a high base stamina and access to a variety of other attacks that can counter a grappling opponent. Since most animals with horns and antlers defend themselves more effectively with their feet, there are plenty of examples of similar builds like zebras and camels that are equally viable without horns equipped at all. However, in builds like rhinos that spec into bulk instead of speed, horns are fundamental to their combat strategy and viability suffers significantly if their horns are damaged. When equipping your character, it's important to consider both your own character's stats.
But who are you in combat against if you're a rhinoceros? Like, the horn isn't that important to a rhinoceros from a, like, fighting perspective. Like, you know what's good for a rhinoceros from a fighting perspective is being as big as a rhinoceros. Like, I don't know if I fully buy that. And, like, yeah, the visual aid it has is it's like a rhino fighting against a hippopotamus, but, like, I don't believe that is a very common interaction that happens, is like 1v1 combat, a rhinoceros versus a hippo, where the rhino is really being like, man, I wish I still had my horn.
And the types of attackers you're likely to encounter before you decide to spec into an expensive skull weapon. For example, if the primary threat in your server is a build from the Panthera faction, horns might not be the most optimal choice, since a big cat's primary objective is to land a critical strike on the opponent's neck, so you may be better off investing in more forceful kicks that can be used while keeping your head out of reach. But if the meta is more centralized around canine builds, front-facing weaponry may be the better option, since canines tend to target their prey's rear and get kills via bleed damage. The most viable horn users are well-rounded with respect to speed, bulk, and overall combat movesets, but most importantly, they spec their characters to be best equipped to counter the most dangerous threats in the current meta. Now, since the best insight into the metagame can be found in characters make eyesight a less overpowered ability, the best. Properly equipped can be tough, especially if your character's eyesight or concentration stats aren't the best. But the good news is,
sure
in an effort to make eyesight a less overpowered ability, the devs have started introducing more benefits to players that spec into auditory abilities. One of which is the advent of the audiobook. Audiobooks are an amazing way to optimize your efficiency. Allowing membership gets you access to one free title every single month, yours to keep forever. Start your membership today and save 60% on your first 3 months of membership, bringing the price down to less than $6 a month. Go to audible.com/cheersu to get started. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks especially to my patrons on Patreon.
Alright. I gotta say, I'm not very convinced by that. I guess he wasn't really like trying to convince us that like horns were really, really strong, I suppose. Like he posited the question, but he wasn't necessarily like looking to make the argument, it seemed like. The other thing that was kind of weird at the end of that was when he was talking about how horns are like not a good choice against cats. He said Panthera specifically. And I would argue that it's like mostly the opposite. Like the example he gave was lions, which again, it's like the only pack hunting cat out there basically are lions. And so like I would maybe argue that like horns are probably the thing you want to do against cats because cats tend to be solo hunters more often than not. And if you can get squared up against them, the horns are actually going to be effective. Whereas with your dogs, like, yeah, they're going to be great against a solo dog because a solo dog doesn't want to fight you head to head. It wants to nip at your heels until you bleed out and fall asleep. But dogs are also going to come at you in a group of several pretty much every time. And so I would, like, he phrased it as like a cat versus dog thing, but I think, again, like the more productive, more useful way to think about it would be to think of it as a pack hunting versus solo hunting thing. Horns probably good against solo hunters, less good against pack hunters. And then just because I got it out, we'll take a look at my couple little visual aids I brought out here to show y'all. So I have horn there, and then a set of antlers here. And a lot of people will talk about kind of what the difference is between like antlers and horns, and it got briefly touched on in the video too, where we talked about how more often than not an antlered animal is it's only going to be the males that have antlers typically, and typically it's going to be something that is shed and regrown every year. There's exceptions to the former one. I don't know if there's any exceptions to the latter. I think with antlers, they universally do get dropped off and regrown every year. But I know there are species where both the males and the females do grow antlers. And it's kind of interesting to think about is that antlers are bone. Like, that's what they are. They're like dead bone, basically. So what happens is every year they grow this whole set of antlers. You'll also hear people talk about like the velvet on antlers, which is basically velvet is basically just skin, but it's skin that has like extra blood vessels in it. And so I talked about right at the beginning how growing antlers is really expensive, and a big part of that is how fast they grow. Like growing this much bone in a matter of like a couple months is nuts. You like don't see this in anything else. And it needs a lot of blood flow to maintain that. Like I said, it's really calorically expensive to do something like that. And so when they grow, they have this velvet on them that has like all this extra vascularity in it, all this extra blood flow to it that facilitates it growing that fast. And then once they reach whatever the size is going to be for that year, all that skin dies, sloughs off, and you're left with this. And so what you have here is bone that's not getting any blood flow to it now. And bone needs blood flow to survive. And so basically what happens is once that velvet falls off, this is dead. This is no longer like living tissue anymore. And so they keep it basically through mating season. And then at a certain point during the mating season, or I suppose, at the end of the mating season, basically, and I assume this is like a hormone thing, basically, is they'll start getting kind of eaten away at the base, and eventually they'll both just fall off. And it can actually be something of a problem for antlered animals sometimes, where if they get like a single antler knocked off, they can have like balance issues because of the weight of them. Not a huge issue for something that's the size of a whitetail, but think about like a moose. If you're an adult moose and you lose one of your antlers, whether it's fighting or like I said, whether it's just the end of mating season and one of them drops off way earlier than the other one for whatever reason, you're now stuck with something that like is like a double-digit number of pounds weight like on one side of your head that's like constantly tilting your head this way. And that could be a problem. And so it's interesting. Like you talk to other like people who are into biology, and like there's not very many of them who like think very highly of antlers. It seems like, like I said, Tirzu seemed like he wasn't very high on them either. And a big part of it is, I said, one, the caloric need for them, the weight of them, the like relative lack of utility from them outside of like conspecific competition, like competition within species. All of it kind of combines to being something where, I said, a lot of biologists think of them as like a detriment more so than a value when it comes to survivability. Like I said, if it was really true, you would see them go away, like as far as like if it was a detriment to like reproductive fitness. But it's not, because like I said, it makes you more likely to reproduce, and it's not damaging enough to your survivability to be a counterweight to that. But I also have here a horn from something, I honestly don't know, bison maybe. And what's cool about horns is there's two parts to them. And so this part is bone that I'm holding in my hand right now. And so this is the internal part. And so then what you get is a bone portion of it that is always, that grows as the animal grows. And then what grows on the bone is an outer portion of it, a kind of sheath that's made out of keratin. So this is made out of the same stuff that like a fingernail or even like hair is made out of. A keratinous sheath, you'll hear it called. And so they'll Stuff that has horns generally keeps it all year round, because like I said, there's a much more like well-sustained bone core to it. Like I said, with the antlers bone too, but it's by the time it actually is like fully grown, it's dead bone, which is why it falls off and regrows every year. This always has blood flow to it, going to it. Similarly, this always has blood flow kind of associated with it too. So this keeps growing. It gets worn down from usage, but this grows just like your finger or your toenail would basically. And so this has a certain element of turnover to it as well, because such is the nature of like a constantly growing keratin thing. Yeah, and I think I am in agreement with Tirzu in that horns are generally quite a bit better than antlers. But again, I don't think that they are quote unquote OP by any means. I don't think there's really anyone who would argue that it's like, oh man, everything out in nature is like operating around the existence of horns, like trying to figure out just like how to solve, like how to beat horns, how to exist near horns. Like horns aren't OP, humans are OP, and we're the things that everybody else has to figure out how to work around, which, like I said, is what makes us the most OP thing out there. But anyway, Headwater Science Center is open 7 days a week. We're open from 9:30 to 5 Monday through Saturday. We're open from 1 to 5 on Sundays, so swing by after lunch on Sunday. We do these shows most days at 3:30. It's been a little inconsistent around the holidays as far as like what exact days they're happening on. But generally, we try and do them Sunday, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Typically is when they happen. Like I said, it's been a little goofy and inconsistent around the holidays, but hopefully we'll be getting back onto a more regular schedule again. So if you think this is interesting, or if you don't think it's interesting, tune back in anyway. We have several different educators here at the Headwater Science Center. We all kind of take turns doing these little programs. We all we're talking about different topics every day. So, if horns aren't that interesting to you, you can still tune in on, Monday or Wednesday, and they'll probably be talking about something else. So, again, thank you for watching, and I won't see you tomorrow, but somebody probably will.